Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our bull session on Ben Jonson's Sejanus. Thank you for joining us, everyone, both here on the webinar and live on YouTube. I'm Jesse Berger. I'm the Artistic Director of Red Bull Theater, and I'll be your host moderating tonight's discussion, which is a discussion for about an hour. We'll be chatting about the play Sejanus and Ben Jonson and wherever it goes. We did a wonderful reading of it on Monday night, which was performed live, directed by Nathan Winkelstein, who's here with us tonight. The reading is available for viewing till Friday. If you're in the webinar with us now, the way to participate is to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And please do submit questions. I'll ask them. I only have a few questions written down, so I'm dying to hear your questions. It's like we're in a theater and you're raising your hand, but don't raise your hand. Use the Q&A, write it in. I'll see it and I'll ask them as we go along. So just to get things started, some quick introductions. We do have Nathan Winkelstein, our own Associate Artistic Director, with us. He is the director and adapter of Monday's Reading. And our wonderful guest scholar, Henry S. Turner, Professor of English at Rutgers University, and a specialist in Renaissance literature. And for those of you who tuned in early, you heard Henry and I talking maybe about Brecht and Kafka, and I can't wait to see where the rest of this conversation goes. But Henry, if you don't mind, I want to start by asking you, first of all, to raise your glass of wine to my cup of tea. Nathan, what have you got?
I went the tea route.
Tea,
weirdly for me, but I went the tea route.
Good for the voice.
That's good. Okay, so we'll get started. This will be fun. Henry, I just have a couple of. I wanted to start off with a general question about
Absolutely.
Sejanus in general, because I know a lot of our audience will know the play and might have seen the reading, and if they haven't, hope they have another day to see it. But some people might be tuning in who don't know anything about the play. So if you could talk just a little bit about the place of the play itself in the Shakespearean and Johnsonian canons or the milieu of Elizabethan or Jacobean drama, that would be great. And then any thoughts or responses about seeing the play live on Monday?
Absolutely. Signal me when it's time to transition, Jesse, once I get going, I get into it. So Sejanus was Jonson's first tragedy. It was published it was performed 1603 to 1605 is typically when we date the play. 1603 is first performance, and 1605 is the publication. So James I, or James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, comes to the throne in 1603. So it's the same year that this play is first performed. And the play is, I would say, in its Roman imagination, it's very indebted to some of the court iconography and ideology that James himself cultivated. There was a turn, really, in English court culture towards the Roman model and towards an imperial model that Rome represented. We don't really see that empire in this play, but we see at the beginning of obviously a really fascinating engagement on Jonson's part with what we could call absolute power. The Roman emperor is a understandable and an interesting model for someone like James and for a monarchical culture like England. Jonson had written a lot of comedies. He had not written any tragedies. He had reinvented comedy for the stage in this period, and he'd really turned it into a form of social commentary and satire.
Was this after, just because I know a lot about Jonson, but I don't know that much about Jonson, really. It was before Volpone and The Alchemist, and The Silent Woman, but after things like, you tell me.
Right. So Every Man in His Humor, I think, is the first play that he wrote. Every Man Out of His Humor is the first play that he staged, that he performed. So Every Man In, Every Man Out. I think Poetaster is maybe the third one. Then Cynthia's Rebels, which is the great Jonson scholar, Joseph Lowenstein, who is at Washington University in St. Louis. He did an amazing reading of Cynthia's Rebels. He calls it an audition for the mask form. Jonson is aware of James's arrival, and he wants to basically be someone who is commissioned to write masks for the court. So Cynthia's Rebels, we talked about this. It's an amazing play. It's not often read. It was performed by a boys' company. You can imagine it today in, I think, a very interesting form. And I think after Cynthia's Rebels is Sejanus. So, I may have the sequence slightly wrong. But all of those are comedies up to that point. Volpone is 1607. The Alchemist is 1610. Silent Woman is, I think, 1609. So it's really Volpone, Silent Woman, Alchemist, and then Bartlemy Fair, I think, is 1612. So that's the kind of spread. And after Bartlemy Fair, there are other great plays. The Devil's an Ass is a great play, but he does taper off at that point.
And
Cataline is in there too. That's the
Cataline
other.
is in there too. That was after the
Yeah,
Sejanus?
that's 1612, I think. Yeah,
So he tried his hand at tragedy one more time.
he did.
Yeah.
He did.
Yeah, I know it's hard. I know we never know the answer to this question, but I'm curious because in 400 years later, if you're following Ben Jonson, as I am, The Alchemist, Volpone, and then some others are talked about. In his time, he had already made a name for himself by the time of Sejanus, is what you're saying, as a writer and a performer too, right? Well, do we know if the masterpieces that we consider the masterpieces were considered so in his time?
Yeah, I think so. I think that The Alchemist and Bartlemy Fair were recognized. They were popular plays. They were recognized as very successful plays. I think Epicene was a popular play. He had some unpopular plays. Poetaster and Sejanus were two of the very unpopular plays, two plays that were very controversial, two plays that were pulled quickly. I think in the case of Poetaster, maybe performed one time and then revived later. The other thing about Jonson, you always have to bear in mind that he's a playwright who writes for the stage, but who has extraordinary sort of skepticism at some intellectual level toward theatricality. So that's a very complicated thing about Jonson. He's an amazing theatrical writer, but he is at the same time in his critical theory. So he's really operating as a poet, writing all the poetic forms, but non-performative forms. Then he's a playwright, he's a mask writer, and he's a critic. So he is always constantly reading, always thinking about how to change the terms of evaluation for the field of literary writing. We talk about Jonson as one of the first author figures in the history of English literature. He's the first, I don't think he's the first authored folio publication. I believe that was James the First, but he's the first dramatist to publish an authored folio. So he's very aware of print and print culture. And he's simultaneously, with one eye, he's looking and using the theater. With the other eye, he's thinking about the history of the book and the book format. So he's constantly revising his plays for print, adding things in print, epistles, epilogues, things that frame the play and revisit retrospectively the terms and the conditions of its first performance, and put in the mouths of his characters a critical idiom that lets an audience learn how to watch the plays that he has already written. There's a complicated.
He did that with Sejanus too, right? It was a notorious flop. It was a notorious flop, as I understand it. And then he revised it. And Nathan, you taught me this. He revised it when it came to publication time, right? Do we know? Is there a quarto folio kind of thing with his plays, or did he burn them all?
Well, in his case, there's emphatically a different. I mean, there's a difference, and there's multiple versions of many of the plays. So some of the plays are quite different. One of the interesting versions of that is Every Man in His Humor, the first play.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And the first version is an Italian comedy. So it's set in Italy. It has Italian characters. It's recognizably a kind of London setting, but it's dressed in Italian clothing. When he revises it for the folio, he completely changes it to an English setting. He changes all the names, and mostly the plot is the same. There are a few, I think, scenes that are different. And that's an interesting thing, that it kind of shows you how he's looking at Italian models. And that sometimes gives us a window to what Shakespeare's doing. If you think about a play like Two Gentlemen of Verona or The Comedy of Errors, looking at Roman comedy. They're both, if you're studying comedy in this period, you study the Roman models in school. And so that's naturally one of the templates that you use for your own.
Yes, I wonder if you talked, I could talk for hours about Jonson. You talked about, in the lobby chat, you talked so eloquently about the play Sejanus and its political resonance. And I wonder if you could turn to just a couple minutes of responding to the reading as you saw it on Monday night, and what any new thoughts you might have come out of that.
so many thoughts about it. I thought the reading was an excellent production. I really need to say that. It's not a play you see very often. It's an incredible privilege as someone who likes Jonson to see the play performed. I didn't know what to expect from a staged reading over Zoom. And the actors, first of all, the cast was really incredible. I mean, as a body of people and their execution of the script, it was tremendous. And as a web production, I just thought it was so well delivered with all the voices, all the faces there, the engagement among them, the way that the screen allowed us to really see the aside as a structural feature of that play, where characters are standing aside, they're talking among themselves and observing other characters, possibly being overheard by those characters. That's always a really strong ambiguity in this play. It's a play that uses the convention of the aside in a very self-conscious, very critical, very political way. And I thought that the screen really, really captured that. I really appreciated the sort of the cast of color that was performing the play. And it really brought out some of the resonances. You know, some of those early speeches are all about how we are slaves to Sejanus. And that there's been a lot of really interesting critical work on that word in the last 3 to 5 years, where, you know, you don't think of it anymore. It's impossible to think of it as just a kind of a colloquial insult. You really have to hear it historically as something that is actually directly referencing the experience of enslaved people. And the way that was brought out in the performance, I thought was really compelling, especially resonant with our own moment, where there is so much white supremacy, you know, driving our politics. And I thought it was a really, really significant aspect of this performance, and something that brought out a dimension of the power in the play that I hadn't really thought about.
That's really great response to hear, and thank you. And Nathan, I would turn to you, and bravo. I also thought it was a terrific reading. And you know, Nathan, I was dubious about Sejanus when you first talked to me about it. I would love it, Nathan, if you'd respond to some of what Henry just said, but also then talk to us, tell our audience about a little bit about 4 years you've been wrestling with this play, and time, you know, a lot's changed in 4 years, but and then again last year around this time, I guess it was, I don't remember when, you said, I really want to do Sejanus, I really want, you know, and I really want to do it this year. And when we said, yes, let's do it. And here it is. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what were you thinking in the first place, you know, when you first encountered Sejanus, and then your journey about it, and what did you learn about it in this process and the performance?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting listening to the scholarship around Jonson, because honestly, like, I guess I probably know more than the layperson just because of the nature of my job, but I'm much more of a practitioner than I am a scholar. And 4 years ago was really near the beginning of my time as having an artistic voice at Red Bull. And I was like, well, maybe I should know something about the types of plays that apparently the theater I work for is interested in. And so I was like, well, maybe I'll read some Marlowe and some Jonson. And I was reading them, and I got to this play, and it was, not coincidentally, it was December of 2016. When I read the play for the first time. Some stuff had happened that had me thinking a lot about, you know, the world we live in, politics, things like that. And I read this play, and I remember it was on the second page of the script was the line, tyrants' arts are to give flatterers grace, accusers power, that those may seem to kill whom they devour. And I went, okay, what is this play? And I continued to read it, and I just was fascinated by how a play written 400 and change years ago about a time 2000 and change years ago could have so many moments that were resonant. And the way I approach plays is, especially these kinds of plays, is I almost never read a play expecting to be like, look at this incredibly performable play, because almost always I would already know about it. So the way I tend to go about looking at a play is I go, is there a performable play inside what I am reading? And with this one, I think especially it was yes, but it's deeply inside. And actually hearing what you said a little bit, Henry, about Jonson as sort of also a critic and a writer and a very let's say self-consciously intelligent person in a way that like Shakespeare's very good at disappearing into his plays, so much so that we like to pretend that he didn't write them. Ben Jonson, Ben Jonson doesn't disappear into any of his plays. You always know that it's a Ben Jonson play when you read him. And that's actually a challenge in terms of creating a playable script is how do I make one where all of these modern resonances, the why of the play, the fact that it has something to say to us today, still exists while still allowing the characters to have a why for why they're saying this, other than that Ben Jonson would like to say this, was an interesting challenge. And that really took me 4 years and will probably take me longer, frankly, to continue to figure out with this play. But it did feel sort of like showing my baby to an audience. Like it had always been kind of mine before, and I was very nervous, and I was very glad that it was a watchable and entertaining evening. So that was great.
Well, it certainly was that, and really fascinating. I mean, it's really difficult text, and you've had a superb group of actors, and you led them superbly through it. And I think the political resonances of it were really apparent, and the kind of cloak and dagger of the world of the play, which is so much I didn't study Sejanus. I read it a few times, and then you sent me a few cuts along the way, and then of course I participated in the reading we just did. But I'm you know it a lot better than I do. But my feeling about it, having watched it just recently, is it's so cloak and dagger, and that the close-ups of Zoom in some ways helped us with that. There's so many whispered asides or whispered conversations, and I think that may be one reason why it's less successful on the stage. Because that's much harder to achieve in a theater.
Yeah, I mean, there is
just one or two great kind of broad dramatic moments, which maybe I'll use that to turn. Harry Kaplan has asked a question in our Q&A, and this might turn on some of the point I just made that I'd love to have you respond to. And Harry says, all Rome turns abruptly against Sejanus at the end with no clear motivation provided. This is certainly consistent with the spirit of the play, but it still seems a little weird. Harry, I hope my inflection is good. Was there more about this turn of all society in the huge amount of the play that Nathan had to cut from Jonson's version?
No. So there is more to that. There's actually an element that I cut because while it is historically accurate, it is so horrific that it is frankly distracting, which is that Sejanus's daughter, who was killed, was a virgin, and they weren't allowed to kill virgins, so they made sure she wasn't, and then they killed her. And that is explained in the speech. And I trimmed that because I considered it just frankly so upsetting as to be distracting from the overall point. But no, and I'm glad, Harry, that you brought up the end of the play, because something I was going to say about the change between 4 years ago, doing it 4 years ago, and doing it now is the events of January 6th. And before January 6th, I felt the same way as you did. I felt like the end was sort of a very kind of heightened Jacobean thing. He's like, and now you sympathize with him. Whoa. And like, okay, whatever. And I was pretty seriously considering trimming most of it. And then, and I want to be careful here. In general, this play and the characters of this play defy one-to-one comparisons with modern politicians. And it is not fair to modern politicians or to these characters to do one-to-one comparisons. This play is quite literally a play for all time, not for just this time. However, this moment is, we saw on January 6th, we saw a crowd attack our Capitol shouting, hang Mike Pence. They weren't shouting, hang Chuck Schumer. They weren't shouting, hang Nancy Pelosi. They were shouting, hang the number 2 of our nation because of the words of the number 1 of our nation. And that is identical to what happened in this speech. There is nothing heightened about this moment. Good God, do I wish there was. But I find it the most upsetting part of the play.
It's an incredible part of if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Johnson's direct translation into English of speeches and sections of Tacitus, which he was reading at the time. So that's also extraordinary that from a literary point of view, it's actually the performance of a source text, which is so graphic. And I'm glad you cut that part. At the same time, I think that there's something so extreme about those details that it really gives the play the flavor of a horror theater that is something I'm very, very interested in. The relationship between terror and horror and how we would maybe distinguish between those two words, or if we can. But it is unbelievable. I completely agree with Nathan. It's unbelievable to see what happens on January 6th of 2021 and see this play so prescient and part of it. And, it's worth remembering that, I mean, even in our own day, we refer a lot in our political imaginary to the people. And in Jonson and Shakespeare's period, they also are very aware of the people, the populace, as one of the classical sources of political authority. So, even back in Aristotle, if you think about the politics and the different sort of the anatomy of political systems that he describes, and he actually, when he gets to democracy, there are a couple different kinds, and one kind is the bad kind. And even demos as a word, it really refers to the popular and the poor. And there is something very alarming about democracy to Aristotle because it is so homogeneous, so undifferentiated, so unreflective. The people are a very complicated category for these playwrights. If you think in Shakespeare's period, or in Shakespeare's work, a little bit later, Coriolanus, another play that is very relevant to our times. This is a play that is also thinking a lot about the people as a political force. So I think there's a kind of awareness of this at the moment. How it relates to the actual social structure of England is a very complicated question, because there is nothing like it really in England in the way there is in the imagination of Rome. But exactly. I think that's what's happening in that. To some degree, that's what's happening. Obviously, it's filtered through Tacitus, but it is an electric moment.
Right. Very much so. And I think there's a line, I don't know if I'm quoting it exactly, that jumped out at me. Oh, beware the popular rage, or something like that. Is that right, Nathan? Did I get that right?
Yes, I can't remember. Yes. But I can't quote the entire play yet by heart, but that is in there.
That one jumped out.
Here it is. Oh, popular rage, alas, they follow fortune and hate men condemned, guilty or not.
Yeah, I think, well, that's good. Yeah. Can you, a couple of things have come up in in both of what you're saying in the conversation that are also being asked about in the Q&A. So I think, sure. Let me just ask both of you these questions. William Marks is asking, and I think it ties into some of the conversation also about Coriolanus as well, but and perhaps about Titus Andronicus and just the Roman plays. But can you talk, maybe Henry, about Jonson's vision of Rome versus Shakespeare's, and was he reacting to Julius Caesar? And then Nathan and Henry, Anne McDonald is asking us, what genre do you consider Sejanus to be?
I love that.
You mentioned already terror and horror. So
I want to hear what Nathan says about that question. Shakespeare's vision of Rome and Jonson's vision of Rome. That's a very good question. It's a hard question to be succinct about. I would say that Jonson and Shakespeare, let me say this first, few playwrights are more divergent, actually. And it's a wonderful thing about the period that we have two playwrights who are so different. They're so different in their style. Sejanus is, incidentally, we haven't talked about this yet in any of our things, but it is a pinnacle of what we call the plain style. It is so incredibly lucid. Every word has been chosen carefully. When you read Shakespeare, it's a totally different experience. Jonson's settings, his characterization, his social themes, the almost proto-anthropological, sociological imagination he has, very different from Shakespeare, who's much more of a kind of romanticist in some ways. But in their vision of Rome, I think they come close to one another. They're very, very interested in the politics, in the betrayal, in the magnetism and the charisma of certain key figures. So like well, not so much Julius Caesar himself, but Brutus, say, in that play. In Titus Andronicus, I mean, many different characters. Who's the emperor in Titus Andronicus? Is it Satrius?
Saturninus.
Saturninus, yes, exactly. Satrius is in Johnson's play.
Yeah.
Saturninus is an absolute Johnsonian character. Completely, he's basically walked off the stage of Sejanus in a sense. So I think that their visions are very similar, and their visions, I think it's really the problem of Rome in a political terms for the imagination of this period is, on the one hand, it is Republican Rome. It is the beginning of a representative, which is very foreign, obviously, to the Renaissance. It's the beginning of a kind of representative democracy, let's put it that way, where the people have a kind of delegated authority or represented authority. And that's what Coriolanus is about. It's about the problems that happen in that delegation and representation. But on the other hand, there is the emperor and the imperial Rome. So these two imaginations of political power, political organization, they're very different. They're different historical moments, sometimes presented as a triumph when you move from the Republic to the Empire, sometimes represented as a degeneration. If you think about Sejanus, after Tiberius is Caligula.
Right.
And after Caligula is Nero, and Rome burns. So this is the beginning of the end. I would say Shakespeare isn't quite as fatalistic as Jonson is, maybe. But it's a very, very interesting question. What do you think, Nathan? Would you have a thought about the genre of the play?
Yeah, I mean, the way I separate Shakespeare from Jonson and Marlowe in general is that Marlowe and Jonson are, at least to me, if I were to overly generalize, are cynics. They think humans suck. And they're going to tell you about how sucky humans are. Like, all of their plays to some extent are about how sucky humans are. Whereas Shakespeare is maybe humanist isn't the right word, but Shakespeare almost always gives us hope and has hope in man, even if not in society. I mean, Jesse and I have discussed this with like the great villains of Shakespeare, especially the villains who are not white Christian men, but the Shylock and the Othellos are all people who are not brought down by the thing that society tells us is wrong with them. They are brought down by society deciding there's something wrong with them. And that's a particular distinction that Shakespeare makes over and over and over again with his characters. And he always has a kind of a ray of light at the end. Whereas Jonson is explicit that there is no ray of light at the end of this play. He's explicit where he goes, this next guy's even worse. And that's something that Shakespeare tends to avoid. From a genre perspective, I'm not really good at this. I think in just a historical context, it's a history much more than it is a tragedy. I mean, it plays like a history. It reads like a history in terms of its structure and everything like that. In terms of its genre of, if this were to be a stage production, I think somewhat the cloak and daggers of what Jesse's talking about. I was just quickly looking up while you were talking. I was looking up how the TV show Hannibal is described, which is not this new terrible one. It's the older one with Mads Mikkelsen and Hugh Dancy. And looking at that genre description, I would say that Sejanus is an intellectual horror thriller.
How they describe it? That sounds great. That's how they describe the Hannibal.
So they describe Hannibal as a psychological horror thriller but the thing about that, the reason I thought of that TV show in particular is the core of this play is not the cloak and daggers. That's everything around it. The core of this play is two people sitting at a table discussing political manipulation. And that in the Hannibal series, it's Hannibal still as a psychiatrist before they know, and an FBI agent, Hugh Dancy, discussing the psychology of psychopaths. And so it's a political intellectual horror thriller. Is how I would describe it, and for whatever that's worth.
That's exciting. What did Jonson? Jonson himself called it a tragedy. He thought it was a tragedy. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. Yeah, I think
He subtitled it that. I don't actually know.
it's an inevitable genre for a playwright like Jonson. I mean, he's so aware of the classical precedents. He's very aware of genre theory. He's very aware of all the categories that would classify, evaluate literary production in his period and their sources in the classical period. And it's inevitable that he would try to write it because he has such ambition as a poet laureate. He really wants to make a big statement. And I find it really, really fascinating that he didn't write more tragedies.
It is fascinating. I sometimes think about it, and I see that Lila Robbins is joining us, so I'm going to ask her to turn her camera on. Yay! Hold on. Turn on. There she is.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh,
I'm
Hey,
so,
Caesar.
I'm so
Caesar.
sorry to be here late.
We're glad to have you. Hail Caesar.
Hail Caesar's right.
You were fabulous. You were fabulous. We're just talking about Jonson and Shakespeare, and you can just dive right in. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to have missed Mr. Turner's, lecture as tour.
Well, not at all. I hope it was a lecture, Lila. And I really would love to hear your take on Tiberius. Tiberius is the character who fascinates me the most. And one of the things I thought was very interesting about this, the stage reading, is how present Tiberius is actually in the script and on stage. When you read the play, because it's not, visually in front of you, I always think of Tiberius and discuss a lot with Tiberius as being an offstage power person, that he's constantly stepping off, constantly he wants to go to Capri, he wants to go to these other places, he's delegating power, he steps in, blah, 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 and then he's gone. You made them, let's say, very present. What was your feeling about playing Tiberius?
All of what you're saying all really just came from Nathan Winkelstein, our fabulous director, because we never talked about Tiberius sort of stepping away. It was more like a challenge to Sejanus to see what he would do if he were to step away, and this sort of what would be the word, kind of a double jeopardy type of deal, where he comes back and outwits Sejanus at the end. So I think Nathan, that was your sort of interpretation of it, as I recall.
yeah, and I can't remember if this happened because I had solo sessions with both you and Dennis. I can't remember if I said it to you or him. I apologize if I didn't say it to you, but Tiberius strikes me as like the only prince who's trying to be Machiavelli. He's the number one who would rather be the number two and would rather manipulate. So Tiberius, doesn't step away so much as like uses Sejanus and tests Sejanus as an engine, and uses him as long as he is useful and not dangerous, and then takes up the next tool. And we added some emotional engagement to that, which I think there is in the play. But yeah, it's and it is interesting, Henry. I fully agree with you. I read this play and I find Tiberius the most interesting character in the play, and that's why I didn't cut much of the Tiberius and Sejanus scenes, is because, and Lila proved me right. It was like I wasn't sure with that big final speech. Like, she's so wormy and she so talks all around the things she actually means, and I went, well, I'm just going to assume that a great actor can handle this. And Jesse gave us 2 days, so plenty of time. And then Lila mic dropped it, which was amazing.
Lila, I know you just joined, and I don't want to, give you a minute, but I do have a question. We've been talking a little bit about Rome, Shakespeare's Rome, and Jonson's Rome, and just because I happen to know that you've played Cleopatra.
Yes, I played her twice.
I was very privileged to see, and I know you know Shakespeare quite well. And I don't know if you've been in any of the other Roman plays, but I wonder if you would. And as Nathan said, you only had 2 days with Sejanus, 2.5 days. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your experience as an actor in encountering Shakespeare versus Jonson, particularly regarding the Roman plays.
Tackling the verse, you mean? The language? I find the language much more difficult in Ben Jonson. It is quite difficult to decipher. In fact, the first day of rehearsal, I was saying to Nathan that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about right now. And it really took some going through it to sort of break it apart and find the clauses within the clauses within the clauses. And the sentences are long and the paragraphs are long, and like, where are you really landing and how do you navigate that so that somebody can understand what you're saying? You know, even if you intellectually kind of understand maybe what it is, to get the audience to understand it by your inflection or whatever is really a very challenge. It was very challenging. The most challenging language I think I've ever attempted.
You know, it was one of the most successful versions I've ever seen. I have to tell you, it was so well done.
I missed the first part. How many productions have you seen of this fine play?
No, not of Sejanus. I just mean of Jonson. I mean,
Jonson.
In general, yeah.
Oh, of any Jonson.
Yeah,
That's a good question about Sejanus, because I know there was an RSC production in the early 2000s, and that's when I first became aware of the play. And it was, I think, in response to the Iraq War, if I remember it right. How often? I don't know of any productions in this country. Am I missing some, Henry?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, I'm not someone who's totally encyclopedic about this. But yeah, I mean, it's rarely done. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of it was cut. I never looked at the original piece. So is it cut by half at least?
It's cut by I'd say 40% of it is gone. I actually wrote it down because I was curious, because I figured I'd get asked. The full one is 28,000 words, and the one we did is about 16,500. So about 40% of the play is gone, and over half the named characters are gone. We went from 36 named characters to 16 named characters. So.
Oh wow! That's quite a job to pull that one off, to reduce it to that.
Surprisingly, it was fairly invisible. All that I really thought that it was a very good representation of the play. Off stage, off screen, I'd love to talk with you, Nathan, about the real geeks question. You know, what did you cut? I'm so fascinated to hear more from Lila about the experience of reading Jonson. I just will tell a brief story for a moment about teaching Jonson. I taught him in a graduate seminar for a semester, and then again for another semester, the same course. So I spent a year reading Jonson. And at the end of this year, I was working on an essay, and I was reading some criticism. And someone in the course of the essay I was reading quoted a passage from Shakespeare. And suddenly there it was. I couldn't believe how perfumed, how ornate, how complicated, how almost it stunk of I can't even give it in words. I was so used to the sort of plain, sinewy, balanced, hyper syntactic Latinate quality to Jonson, the skeleton, rather than this floral bouquet that was suddenly rising up off the pages for me. And I thought, oh my God, I have to go hide my head. I am someone who suddenly doesn't like Shakespeare. What was your experience, Lila? You've done both. Tell us.
Well, no, I mean, this is the first Ben Jonson I've ever done.
But you've done the Shakespeare, I've
done the Shakespeare, which I said I find much easier and much more easily decipherable and quickly decipherable. And I find that the images are in kind of visual in a way where I can sort of wrap my mind around them, whereas this is all quite dry. And intellectual, it feels to me. And so, I mean, we didn't have to memorize it, obviously, but if we did have to memorize it, I think I would find it more difficult as well, for that very reason, that there are no florid images or what you're just speaking of. But but you know what, I said to Nathan after we had done the reading, now I really want to dig into it, because as you start to work on it, you kind of start to see the juiciness of it. But it takes a while to get to that place, because you're battling so hard with just meaning. Once you get the meaning, now we can start to muscle it in different, directions and maybe squeeze some juice out of it. But I find it quite dry and austere. And
And that's,
Cool, I guess I would call it.
I certainly haven't read all of Johnson's plays, but I wonder if that seems also particularly true of Sejanus in terms of the austerity and the
It is.
intellectuality and the kind of rigor of that. He's incredibly rigorous in his comedies. I know Volpone very well. I know The Alchemist very well. His writing is just as difficult in that, and difficult from a standpoint of cutting it as well, because most of them have to be cut, because he's so carefully constructed everything that you really have to edit or adapt it. You really have to be careful how you're doing it. So Nathan did a perfect job. The comedies, he does seem to have a more of a natural affinity to comedy, to satire. He's really a satirist, I think, and I think that probably leads into the tragedies too. But he's racing. He's so much fun in the comedies, but it's again a totally different kind of spirit than the Shakespearean comic spirit. It's a satirist spirit, and that's how I see it. I want to go, Nathan. I have some questions that are burning up my screen.
Okay.
One from the audience. So before we run out of time, this is a great conversation. Rebecca from Texas. Hi, Rebecca. Rebecca has, I don't dare pronounce your last name, so I'm just saying Rebecca from Texas. I recognize you. I'm glad to see you here. Why was there no, this is a very specific question for Nathan. Why was there no punishment for the physician? I was quite surprised by that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I don't know if that was, I saw a similar question mistakenly get dropped in the chat. I don't know if that was also you, but the I think because that's true. So first of all, the doctor, poor Stephen, I mean, he probably wouldn't have accepted it otherwise, but the doctor is supposed to have his two scenes, be a lech, make something happen, and then disappear. And I was like, well, I need another follower for Sejanus. So, and the doctor's interested in rising, so I'm going to give him a bunch, and I'm going to assume that that Sejanus rose up this man. But it's all in that final scene, and their assumption that Macro is going to become an even bigger prodigy than Sejanus. There's no point, if you are a manipulative tyrant taking over for a manipulative tyrant, you're only going to bust up the true loyalists to that man. All the other ones are perfect for you. They're the manure in which you shall grow. Like Eudemus and Varro, who also receives no punishment, of course they don't. In the same way that, again, I try to avoid one-to-ones with this, but there are one-to-ones. And so they're the perfect people to keep if you're Macro, because their loyalty is to who's ever more powerful. And so now that's Macro, so they'll be totally loyal to Macro, and until he gets taken over. So, I think that that's very true of how politics works. And as a little bit of a comment on like the dryness we talked about, it's kind of Ben Jonson's point. All of these people are brain first, as opposed to a lot of Shakespearean characters, which are heart and imagination first. They're brain first intellectuals who go after what they want. And that's as far as it goes, right? And they'll do whatever they need to do to go after what they want. It's a bunch of psychopaths, basically. It's oversimplification. But yeah, so Macro has no reason to take those two down, and nor does Tiberius. And so they last.
Speaking of Macro, I thought Matt Rausch was astounding the other night. I thought he was just incredible.
Yeah,
really wonderful
I
performance.
agree, Lila, but this was an astounding cast. Everyone was really terrific, and so we always have great casts at Red Bull Theater. This one was remarkably terrific, and thank goodness, because it was remarkably difficult material, and everyone rose to the occasion, and it was really, Nathan's great direction. There's a question from Harry Kaplan. Nathan, this is directed at you, but also at me, but I'm going to throw it at you, and you start, all right, because it's about casting at Red Bull in general, but for your casting of Sejanus, being quite gender blind, except females were cast in male roles, but no males were cast in female roles. So And Harry says, and I think he's right, that's typical of gender blind classing in the theater, except that we know a lot of these plays were originally performed by boys. So, or men playing, boys playing women's roles. So talk to us about your decision in terms of gender blind casting for Sejanus.
Yep. So this is a complicated and evolving question, both when it comes to gender and when it comes to race, and when it, all of these questions are of course evolving, because these plays originally started as all men and all white. And so everything from there evolves. To me, I don't personally believe very much in gender blind or color blind casting. I believe that asking the audience to ignore the semiotics of the person performing the role creates an unnecessary hurdle. So why create a hurdle out of something that can be a beautiful addition to the piece? And so for me, Laco is.
Just to clarify that for me, so I understand. So do you mean when you cast Lila as Caesar, Lila is playing a female Caesar, Lila is not playing a male Caesar?
Correct.
That's the kind of rule of thumb for you in casting.
Yes. So Caesar is, and what I decided in terms of the genders and the pronouns and so on and so forth, was I changed it very, very selectively. So I did, whenever Caesar was referred to as the parent of Drusus, she was the mother. But whenever Caesar was referred to as the title and position of Caesar, a traditionally male position, they thought of, they basically had the woman was subsumed by the role in the way they refer. Caesar was male. The person who was Caesar was female, was how I thought about that. And I did change the language. For example, the pronouns for Sabinus, performed by Tamara Tooney, I did change that. Now, that said, for what it's worth, we just did a Romeo and Juliet where admittedly there were only 5 people playing every single role in the play, but where the nurse was male, was played by a male and was clearly a female, right? But that also lives in the long-term British history of the panto dame. So there's a very particular category that fits into, but that's also different because there's 3 clowns.
I mean, I think it's also possibly, Harry's question is interesting, it's possibly trickier when there's a tradition of camp with men playing female roles in a way that there isn't so much with females playing male roles. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I agree. I don't find myself as tempted to switch men to women. Also, like, there's enough male roles. Like, why are we going out of our way? Whereas, like, there's amazing female, like, some of it is just like, how was I able to get the amazing cast I was able to get? Well, I had multiple genders to choose from, as opposed to if I went, well, every single role in this play other than one is male, but otherwise I wouldn't have had Lila, right? Like, so part of it is also like, let's let the big wigs who happen to not be the original gender come and play. And bring that color and bring, but I guess at the end of the day, I'm not interested in watching a female play a male Hamlet. I'm interested in watching a female play a female Hamlet and bring to it what their experience is, what their lived experience is. And that's a way to be new with shows that have existed for 400 years is let's see a new experience in that role. And many of these roles can encompass that. And I find that really exciting, actually. To see that. That's a much longer conversation.
Oh, it's a really interesting, big conversation. There's a whole nother seminar to have about gender in classical theater. I mean, we did a production of Shakespeare's Macbeth performed by 7 women, but that production was also really interrogating gender and Shakespeare and being a young woman, so whereas in my experience of Sejanus, Nathan, was that gender was totally irrelevant. It wasn't a play. I didn't have anything to do with it. It was just people in positions.
Yeah, I thought, I nudged a little bit about like Tiberius and Sejanus's relationship, and there might be stuff that I'd be interested in digging into there in a longer one. But I think that's very mild. But yes, I agree. They're politicians. They're politicians dealing with one another. And just like today, I also wanted it to represent a modern political climate.
Right.
So
Lila, you were going to say?
I think I missed the first part of the seminar. But Henry, you said you were fascinated with the character of Caesar. And what particularly fascinates you about Caesar? Yeah.
So it's very germane to what we're talking about, and I'll try to sort of be as clear as I can about it. But it really is something that Nathan, you've already alluded to in the distinction between the kind of the name and the body, or almost the privacy of the actor being female, and the maleness of the office or of the title.
Uh-huh.
That's what fascinates me about Tiberius and about this play in general, is this third category that we would call office, this impersonal role that different people can have. And that's true in politics. It's true in any large organization. A university, a company has, this is a total non sequitur, but one of the things that's fascinating about Trump is that he kind of confused our distinction between the president as the president in an office sense and the president as an individual person. They collided. You could call it the corporate person of president, and the individual person of Trump became blurred. And that was something that was very difficult for, I think, our culture to deal with. And I think that Jonson is really, really interested in this play, in the relationship between the office of Tiberius and the person of Tiberius. And there's this incredibly subtle play between Tiberius speaking as you could think of it as a human being, as a person with motives, as a person with will, with manipulation, with psychology. Mm-hmm. And Tiberius speaking as emperor, where psychology, will, personality kind of evaporates. And there's something very impersonal about it. So maybe just to be succinct about it, it's the play between the impersonal and the personal in Tiberius that I find so interesting. And the mask, the veil, it passes over Tiberius, where you just don't know exactly who Tiberius is and what she thinks. Because even the language is so speechifying. It's so ideological. It's so rhetorical. It's so quotational from the very beginning. Tiberius doesn't open their mouths without saying something that they know is already public consumption and is kind of spin. So there's almost also a theory of media there, where, when you get into a media platform, are you speaking as a person, as a private person, or as a public person? What is a person? I mean, Jonson's interested in this because he's a theatrical writer. Yeah. I mean, the word person comes from the theater. It actually means mask originally. And it's a theatrical concept.
Well,
the sense of the public self or the performative self. And I found that in doing this, I didn't quite know how to get in, but there is this thing of whatever's happening, a certain thing will be presented. And underneath it, to try to show some of that subtext, why you're presenting that public office.
Yeah, and Aruntius comments on it, right? Aruntius says, if this were true, but the space between the breast and the lips, it's... and that's very, very, it's very commented upon in the play. And it is a weird, the subtext and sarcasm of these characters is not something that you see nearly as much in Shakespeare as you do in Jonson. It's a different game. I mean, there is subtext in Shakespeare. That idea that there isn't is ridiculous. But to have people actively saying things that they don't mean is almost non-existent in Shakespeare. And it's fascinating to try to deal with this incredibly dense language and deal with the fact that the characters themselves are obfuscating what they're saying. It's like this double layer of communication challenge. But when it gets nailed, the way Lila was able to do it in just 2 days, go, what cool layers.
I agree. I thought you did an amazing job, Lila. That you said it so perfectly, Nathan. The self-obfuscating speech. How do you speak publicly in the awareness that you are putting on a mask of impersonality to obscure your actual motive?
Yeah.
And to be aware and to show that awareness without, or to disclose that awareness without showing that awareness. I lose language to talk about it because no one in the play can see that happening, or maybe they can a little, but we see Tiberius very self-consciously manipulating this gap between the private person and the public appearance. very
Right.
knowing about that.
Right.
Fascinating.
And to navigate the public and the private without illustrating the private, because
Yes.
then you just make everyone stupid.
Yes,
Do you see,
exactly.
if you
Yeah,
push
yeah.
that side of it too hard, then you make everybody else in the room stupid.
Yep. You
Yeah.
So
can't
it's a
pour
real fine line.
So tricky.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfectly said. Yeah,
Mm.
I do want to say one of the things that made it clearer. I mean, I love live theater, but I one of the things I liked about it in the Zoom theater was that because you could lean into the camera and you could give something so subtly, and I know you could do that in the theater too, Lila. But there was something about having you right there on full screen doing it that was quite powerful. But we're coming close to the end of our time together, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody who's watching online gets their questions in.
Oh.
Because before we do have to say goodbye. So if you got something on the tip of your tongue, Anne McDonald is commenting. Just to respond to some of what Henry you talked about, she's sharing the classic 16th century idea of the king's two bodies, which you probably know more about, Henry, than I do. But I think that's a good
it is.
thing to add to what you were saying. Do you,
That was Anne McDonald of
McDonald? Yeah.
Shakespeare Society.
Oh yes, yes.
Hello, Anne McDonald.
It's an excellent reference, and it's very true. You know, that's a huge part of their political imaginary, is the idea that there's the king or the queen, and then there is this other imaginary body. And they use a kind of, Christian, almost what's called theological, metaphysical sort of way of thinking about this. By the time you get to Thomas Hobbes, he actually uses the theater as his way of thinking about that relationship. And I think Jonson and Shakespeare are both really thinking about that concept of the king as a person in the private sense, and the king as a public person, or power as an individual and power as office. And they're really thinking about it. They grasp the theatrical quality to that really, when you act as the emperor, you really are the emperor. You become the emperor because you act that figure.
Mm-hmm.
And that figure, the thing that's so complex and that Hobbes got is that you act as that power, but it is not a fiction. Or it is a fiction, but it's a real thing. It's a real fiction. You act as president,
Right.
and you are president. Your actions have consequences.
Could I also add, because Anne correctly called me out on that other comment, can I add something about that? Because it actually goes back to something that was said at the beginning. I know we're getting near the end. Anne called me out on the fact that, of course, there are plenty of Shakespeare characters that don't say what they mean, like all the great villains and Hamlet, for example. But I think what I meant is Tiberius, he's a very Tiberius, very interesting character, because they never show us, including that they never soliloquize to us. They have one solo speech, and that solo speech is, unlike most soliloquies, directly targeted at the idea of Sejanus, not to the audience. The only people who soliloquize in this play are, interestingly, Sejanus, Macro takes it from him, and which is fascinating in its own right. So I think what I meant is, this is a character who is obfuscating at the character level. And the only one, whereas like Hamlet and Richard III tell us what we're doing. Iago's maybe the closest, because Iago's probably the one who's most likely even lying in his soliloquies.
Because he's seducing the audience as well.
Right.
If it's done correctly, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to be complicit in that with Iago to get bamboozled. Right.
Yeah, and this may be one reason why Sejanus is harder for us, is because if you don't know that, what Nathan just said, if you don't know that, then getting to the place of doing a production of it and trying to carry that across the footlights to an audience, that I'm not telling you the truth, even you, the audience, while I'm alone. You have to be a really smart audience to know that, and maybe that's where Jonson fell down. Do you think, Henry? This came after Julius Caesar. Do you think it was kind of in response. I mean, I sometimes think Jonson and Shakespeare were playing tennis, and he's saying, "You got Julius Caesar. I'm going to do Sejanus. His fall."
I think that they're definitely playing tennis. I love that metaphor. I think it's impossible that he wasn't thinking of that play. You know, I mean, the setting, the plot, the treachery, the soliloquy, the characterization. Although it just would be such a wonderful thing to compare the two. All of the discussion we're having right now about characterization, public versus private. There's so much more privacy in Julius Caesar, I think, just sort of intuitively. We get so much more depth and even a domestic scene between Brutus and his wife. And whereas in Sejanus, it's so true. And it's Nathan, I actually never really recognized this, that Sejanus is the only character who discloses a kind of privacy. Because otherwise it's a play that I think of as having no private speech, that it's a kind of horror of a world. And it's really hard to imagine, although it's not hard to imagine. It's the world of Twitter, it's the world of Instagram, where every act of speech is always immediately public. But Sejanus soliloquizes, and that's not something I'd ever really thought of, and I appreciate that comment. I think it feels different. It feels but I guess he's responding to it, definitely.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Henry. Finish your
No,
thought.
no, not at all.
I just wanted to add, William Marks added a comment that I'd forgotten, and which is nice, which is that Shakespeare actually acted in Sejanus, although we don't know, I think, which role he might have played.
Well, they think he was Tiberius.
Oh, even better. I love it. Henry, Lila, Nathan, do you have any burning comments or things that you really want to make sure get said before I bring us to a close? This has been such a great conversation.
I just thoroughly enjoyed working on it, and Nathan was brilliant in his guidance and his clarity about it. I was very lost initially and continued to be so, but I certainly took a good, chip at it, and it was enjoyable. And who knew that this play could be enjoyable at the beginning when we started? But it turned out, it was very satisfying. And I just hats off to Red Bull for always doing these kind of challenging pieces and this sort of material, because God knows we need it, because everything is quite superficial and thin these days. So it's just a pleasure to dig into something so deep and juicy. So thank you.
So lucky to have you, Lila, and you've graced our stages so many times, and we hope more. Nathan, Henry, any final words before I bring us to a close? Well, once I do, it'll be quite abrupt for everybody I know. So.
Amen. I just have to say amen to what Lila just said. That was perfectly said, and I think it was really my overwhelming impression was what an excellent production it was, both in terms of its acting and the presentation of the script, its guidance, the clarity of the production, as well as the complexity. That's the essence of Jonson. Complexity and clarity, and it was really rendered, and I commend the Red Bull for doing it. I thought it's not an easy play, and it was so successful. Well done. I really enjoyed it. A great admiration for everyone involved.
And I just want to add just an immense gratitude towards that cast that for some reason decided to jump on board this train with me. It was so much gratitude towards them, and towards, of course, Red Bull, towards Jesse for letting me do this damn thing, and for all of you who watched it, so that it wasn't just going out into a void. So thank you all.
Nathan, and thank you, Henry. It's great to meet you. This is our first time meeting, and we look forward to more interactions. It's really great to learn about you and your scholarship. And thank you to our online audience. Thank you, Lila, for joining us. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Nathan, for pestering me about Sejanus, and we did it. I'm so glad we did. Thank you again, Henry, and thank you, everyone, for joining us online. Once again, Sejanus, His Fall, can be seen, tell your friends, until tomorrow night at 7 p.m. on YouTube, or you can get to it by our website at redbulltheater.com. You may never get another chance, folks. This is it. So one more day, get Sejanus in. Also, if you enjoyed tonight's programming or anything about Red Bull Theater that you've seen in the last, whenever you've seen it, please check out our upcoming live benefit reading of Ben Jonson's greatest comedy, Volpone, or The Fox, on Monday, June 14th. It's got an amazing cast also, like Sejanus did, led by Andre de Shields, Hamish Linklater, Christine Nielsen, Mary Testa, Peter Francis James, and more. Finally, all of our programming this year is absolutely free, as you might have noticed. So that is only possible with the support of people like you who are watching right now. So if you're able to, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to Red Bull Theater today. You can do it easily on our website. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. That's all. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.
Nice to meet you, Henry. Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Bye,
Bye,
all.
guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lila.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.